Welcome to PHL 1010 Intro to Philosophy for the summer 2019 first session class. And in this video, I'm going to start going over the assigned readings that we have in preparation for discussion 1 and exam 1. So I posted the potential exam questions from which you can choose. And today I'll be going over the beginnings of, for part A, question 1, which is compare the Buddhist view of Anatman to the Hindu conception found in the Upanishads. Which position do you think is better argued, why, and explain? So in this video, I'll be going over the Hindu conception found in the Upanishads. In the next video, I'll go over the Buddhist view and compare it with the Upanishads that we're going over in this video. But also we'll be addressing questions from Part B in the potential exam questions. So Part B, questions 2 and 3. So question 2, Part B, is describe the concept of the ether in the Chandogya Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad, and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So actually they don't mention the ether directly in the Yoga Sutras. They refer to the same container of the cosmos, where the past, present, and future are from which they're projected to create the universe, but they don't call it the ether. So I'll be pointing out the section of the Yoga Sutras where they mention what is comparable to the ether that is mentioned in the Upanishads. And so that'll be discussed in this video. Also, Part B, question 3, who is Vishnu as described in the Katha Upanishad. So I won't be going over Part B, question 1 in this video, which is what are the three gunas as described in the verses on the analysis of nature and the Yoga Sutras. That'll be in another video. So to begin, I'll begin with Part B, question 3, who is Vishnu as described in the Katha Upanishad? And that'll help prepare. It'll introduce us to the general philosophy of the Upanishads, and it'll make analyzing the other ones easier. It's going to put it in the context of the cosmology. So the basic Hindu cosmology expressed in the Upanishads comes down to the relationship between Atman and Brahman. I mentioned in the introductory video for the class that I'll be comparing these philosophical readings to current cosmology, just because I think it provides a helpful analogy. So in the Upanishads, Atman is the self. And there's two manifestations of the self. There's the supreme self, and then there's all of the individual selves, or called elemental selves in one of these Upanishads, which we'll be going over. So the elemental self, or the subordinate self, is subject to the delusion of identifying with the material body. The supreme self does not identify with the material body. The supreme Atman is also one with the other side of divinity called Brahman. So Atman and Brahman. You probably heard of the caste system in India. The highest caste is the Brahmin caste. It's because they have knowledge of Brahman, the self within. So Brahman is the all-pervasive, impersonal ocean of the self, and Atman is the individual conscious ego side of the self. So for the Upanishads, God is a personal, supreme self. And at the same time, this all-pervasive spirit, this more impersonal, just ground of being, Brahman. So Brahman is everything. It's this ocean of potential being. And then within that ocean, according to the cosmology of the Upanishads, the material universes emerge. So there's two worlds. There's the spiritual world where God, or Vishnu, resides eternally. And then there's this material world. So in the selections from the Upanishads that we went over, it addresses this cosmology, but briefly and not in a comprehensive way. So I'm going to just explain it in a more comprehensive way, because it'll help make sense of the brief allusions that they make in these selections that we're reading. So there's two worlds, the spiritual world and the material world. In the spiritual world, Vishnu presides. They don't mention in these texts, but in many different spiritual planets called lokas, planets, means loka means planet. And occasionally a form of Vishnu descends from the spiritual world and goes to sleep on this ocean of cosmic potential being. It's kind of a coagulated section of Brahman. And Vishnu sleeps on the surface of this ocean of potential material energy and exhales all of the material universes like little bubbles from the pores of his skin. And then in the center of each of these bubbles is another Vishnu form from whom the planets in each of the universes emerge, literally from a lotus flower that emerges from his navel. That's not discussed in these Upanishads. And then so what is discussed in the Upanishads that we're reading here is the structure of each of these material universes, and it's just briefly alluded to. But the basic cosmology is that each universe consists of a series of concentric spheres of elements, beginning with the least spiritual, the most material, earth element. It's not the earth planet. In the center of the universe are the planets in a hollow space. And then they're surrounded by these spheres of elements: earth, water, fire, air, and then ether. So that's one of the exam questions. For part B, question number 2. Describe the concept of the ether in the Chandogya Upanishad and the Mundaka Upanishad. So we're going over who is Vishnu is described in the Katha Upanishad now, but in the process of doing that, I need to bring up this concept of the ether. So the ether, this outermost sphere of the universe, is where the past, the present, and the future of all of the interior elements are stored and from which they radiate to create this illusion of material objects enduring through space and time. So for the Upanishads, this world is like a dream. And you need to distinguish between the dream world of the material body and the eternal world of the true self, Atman. And the dream, whose dream is it? It's Vishnu's dream. So Vishnu is the supreme self. So earth, water, fire, air, ether. Ether is the outermost encompassing horizon of the cosmos that contains everything, and it's interwoven with that ether is Vishnu, the supreme Atman. Vishnu is also located in the center of everyone's heart. So Vishnu is the smallest of the small in the innermost core of your heart, and also the all-encompassing ether in I'm hesitating here because in addition to the ether sphere, some of the Upanishads talk about other spheres encompassing that. So earth, water, fire, air, ether, and then mind, intelligence. Some texts say a layer of false ego, and then that would be the outermost sphere. But for our purposes, ether is just the outermost border of the spherical universe, which contains everything within it. And interwoven with that outermost sphere is the Supreme Atman, Vishnu, who is also located in the center of everyone's heart. So I'll be repeating this because that's the basic idea in a nutshell. And if you haven't got it yet, you will by the end of this video. So going now to the Katha Upanishad, the context is this Brahmin boy Nachiketas. And we don't read it in this selection, but what had happened is he had interrupted his father during a fire sacrifice, and his father got angry. And when Nachiketa kept saying, "Who are you going to, give me to?" His father said, "To death, to Yama." Yama's the god of death. Yama Raja. Raja means king. Yama means death. So Yama Raja, the king of death. His father said, "To death." But during the sacrifice, you can't lie. So even though he didn't mean it, the next scene in the Upanishad, the Katha Upanishad, is Nachiketa down in the underworld, waiting for 3 days for the king of death to arrive. Finally, Yamaraj shows up, having neglected to offer water or a kind greeting to a Brahmin. So that's an offense. To purify himself of this offense to a member of the Brahmin caste, the demigod Yamaraj says, "I'll give you 3 wishes." So Nachiketa says, well, I want to go back so my father won't be angry with me. That's not part of this. He said, I want to know what this fire sacrifice was all about. And so he's granted that wish. And as for his third wish, which is where we pick up in this part from our book, Nachiketa said, there is a doubt when a man is dead, some saying he is, others he is not. This I should like to know. Which is a strange thing because Nachiketa is in the afterworld speaking to death personified. But at any rate, he wants to know what happens to the soul after death. So Death said on this point, this is page 213 from our book, on this point even the gods used to doubt. It is not easy to understand. That subject is subtle. Choose another wish, O Nachiketas. Do not press me. Let me off that request. So then Yamaraj bribes Nachiketas with chariots with beautiful horses and celestial demigod ladies. And Nachiketa says, these things last only till tomorrow. No man is made happy by wealth. This is on the left column, further down on page 213. He says, my wish is the only thing I want, which is tell me what happens to the soul after death. So then on the right-hand column, Death replied, know the self to be sitting in the chariot, the body to be the chariot, the intellect the charioteer, and the mind the reins. So here's the basic image. The soul is the Atman is a passenger in the chariot. Your body is like a chariot. The horses are your sense organs, which you can see, smell, taste, touch, and hear. Those are the sources of your knowledge of the material world. They're also the sources of your desire. You see something that you desire, that makes your body move towards that thing. So the horses are your senses pulling the chariot of your body. Your intellect is the charioteer holding your mind. So your mind are the reins. The reins control the senses, tell them where to go. Tell the horses where to go. The horses are your senses. But your soul is just a passenger along for the ride. You're not the body. You're not your senses. And you have to know that. So I'll continue to read here on the right-hand column. He who has no understanding and whose mind is never firmly held, his senses are unmanageable like vicious horses of a charioteer. But he who has understanding and whose mind is always firmly held, his senses are under control like good horses of a charioteer. So if you can control your senses, your sense desires, then your chariot won't be turned off the true path, and you will not be born again if you reach the final destination. So I'll continue reading here. But he whose understanding, who's mindful and always pure, reaches indeed that place from whence he is not born again. But he who has understanding for his charioteer and holds the reins of the mind, he reaches the end of his journey, and that is the highest place of Vishnu. Beyond the senses, there are the objects. Beyond the objects, there is the mind. Beyond the mind, there is the intellect. The great self is beyond the intellect. Beyond the great, there is the undeveloped. Beyond the undeveloped, there is the person, Purusha. Beyond the person, there is nothing. That is the goal, the highest road. So again, going back to this cosmology, each universe is this concentric spheres of elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. Now here we hear about mind and intelligence, and then the great self, which would be the outermost sphere. And then beyond that, there's the undeveloped. That's Brahman, this ocean of potential beings. So the soul has two sides: Atman, the individual personal ego, and Brahman, the impersonal, all-pervasive potential of all things. So the universe is floating in the ocean of Brahman. Technically, it's a kind of a coagulated section of Brahman, but for our purposes, the oceans are floating in Brahman. I mean, not the oceans. The planets are floating in the ocean of Brahman. The universes, which are like little spheres, little planets, but the universes are floating in Brahman. The universes have these concentric spheres. Vishnu is the source of all of these universes. So after you go through these elements, earth, water, fire, air, ether, and in the Katha Upanishad they mention mind, intellect, and the great self. Beyond that is the undeveloped. The undeveloped is Brahman. It's potential. It's not manifest as any particular form. It's the potential that contains all forms. Beyond that, so beyond the undeveloped, there's the person, Purusha. That's Vishnu. Beyond the person, there's nothing. That is the goal, the highest road. So the answer you want to be focusing on for Part B of Exam 1, so I'll just finish what I'm saying and then go back over the way we take these exams. So Part B, question 3, who is Vishnu as described in the Katha Upanishad? Vishnu is the supreme person, the supreme self, and the ultimate goal of life. So you want to guide the chariot of your body and the sense organs towards Vishnu. Otherwise, you'll be doomed to the rounds of births. You'll be born again and again. So the Upanishads have the philosophy of reincarnation. You're a little soul, a part of the supreme Atman. You're just a subordinate Atman. Because we identify with these material bodies, we have to die and be born again in another material body until we can, in one of these material bodies, guide our life towards Vishnu, who exists in this Katha Upanishad outside the universe, that you should guide yourself through these concentric spheres past the mind, the intellect, through the undeveloped Brahman to the person, Purusha, Vishnu. So Vishnu is the personal form of God, the supreme source of Atman and Brahman. He's the supreme Atman, the supreme Brahman. So more insights into the Katha Upanishad will be coming as we address these other Upanishads now. But again, for this class, so there's 4 exams. I count the best 3 of 4. In each exam, there's 2 parts, Part A and Part B. And there's a series of potential questions from which you can choose. You have to choose one Part A question, and you have to write a 250-word essay about that, and you have to choose 2 of the potential Part B questions and write a 100-word essay about each of those. This is all explained in the syllabus. So now we've gone over, if you want to answer Part B, question 3, who is Vishnu as described in the Katha Upanishad. Now I've given you some more help, plus you can cite sections from the Upanishad itself, which is found on page 213 and 214. Now, Part B, question 2, we're skipping question 1 because I'll be going over that in the next couple of videos. But Part B, question 2, describe the concept of the ether in the Chandogya Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad, and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So again, ether's not directly mentioned in the Yoga Sutras, but I'll point out what I'm talking about. And keep in mind also that this video is preparing us for Part A, question 1, which is compare the Buddhist view of Anatman to the Hindu conception found in the Upanishads. So we're beginning to develop our understanding of the Hindu conception of Atman and Brahman in the Upanishads. We've gone over the Katha Upanishad. So now I'm going to go back and go over, beginning with the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and eventually we will hit the Chandogya Upanishad and the Mundaka Upanishad, where they talk about the ether. So that's Part B, question 2. But now I'm going to go back to the first Upanishad in our book. So again, this is our book, Introduction to World Philosophy. Let me go back to the video screen here. Introduction to World Philosophy, a multicultural reader. So we've got a lot of world philosophy to go over, so I'll be moving quickly in these videos. So the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So the scene here is, if you look on page 206, Yajnavalkya. I've heard that pronounced as Jagyavalkya, which I'll be using that. Why is it spelled with a Y and a J if it's pronounced Jagya? But at any rate, he's getting ready to leave the householder life, and he's got 2 wives, Maitreyi and Katyayani. And he says, well, I've got to divide up my wealth between my 2 wives so I can renounce the householder life and live in the forest as a renounced meditator, which it's the standard way to do things. He wasn't just abandoning his family. It was expected in the social context here. So his wife Maitreyi said, my lord, if the whole earth full of wealth belonged to me, tell me, would it make me immortal? This is the top of page 207. So he says, no. So she says, all right, well, in other words, I'm not interested in the wealth. I am interested in immortality. So tell me about immortality. So Yajnavalkya says, "You're truly dear to me. You speak dear words. Come, sit down. I'll explain it to you. Mark well what I say." So we saw the same thing in the Katha Upanishad, where Nachiketas refused he wasn't interested in the bribes of money that Yamaraj was giving. He says, that's not going to help me. I want to know about what happens after we die. Is there eternal life or not? That was his question. They skipped the part where Yamaraj told Nachiketas how proud he was that you resisted these temptations of worldly wealth. It was kind of a test. Now I know you're worthy. Similarly, Maitreyi, she's just focused on the question of immortality. So her husband is pleased with that, and now he begins to talk to her. And he says on the left column of page 207, and he said, "Surely a husband is not dear, that you may love the husband, but that you may love the self, Atman. Therefore, a husband is dear." And he goes on, "Surely a wife is not dear, if you just want to love the wife, but if you can love the self by loving the wife, then the wife is dear. The Brahman caste, all creatures, everything." So I'll skip down to everything. So surely everything is not dear that you may love everything, but that you may love the self, therefore everything is dear. Surely the self is to be seen, to be heard, to be perceived, to be marked. O Maitreyi, when we see, hear, perceive, and know the self, then all this is known. At the bottom of the page there, he says, "Whoever looks for the Brahman class elsewhere than in the self was abandoned by the Brahman class." So this Brahman class, these worlds, these creatures, this everything, all is that self. The self, Atman. It's the source of everything. So if you want to just love your husband or your wife, but you don't see that husband or wife as an emanation of the Supreme Self, and you fail to direct your love to the Supreme Self within your husband or wife, then your husband and wife are not worthy of love. But if you can love the self by seeing the self reflected in everything and in everyone, then it's worthy of loving whoever it is that you meet. But the ultimate goal is to love the Supreme Atman. So continuing here on page 207 on the right-hand column, Yajnavalkya said that the self indeed is his light, for having the self alone as his light, man sits, moves about, does his work, and returns. So now we have another person asking a question. Janaka Vaideha said, "Who is that self?" Yajnavalkya replied, "He who is within the heart, surrounded by the senses, the person of light, consisting of knowledge. He, remaining the same, wanders along the two worlds as if thinking, as if moving." All right, so that's important when we get to the Buddhist texts, which are denying the Hindu concept of Atman. They say if the Atman thinks and moves, it's changing, and if it's changing, it's not an eternal, enduring self. So notice he says it's as if thinking, as if moving. That's what the self within the heart, the person of light. It's as if that person's thinking or moving, but really whatever the Supreme Being is doing is beyond our ability to conceive because we're trapped in these material bodies. But he continues here saying, during sleep, in dreams, he transcends this world and all that is perishable. So I'm going to skip over to page 208, where on the left-hand column he talks about the person as the golden person, the lonely bird. So it gets a little confusing in this Mundaka Upanishad because he's talking about each individual Atman and the Supreme Atman. So when the individual Atman identifies with the body, it gets trapped in the rounds of birth and death. But the Supreme Atman isn't trapped. For the Supreme Atman, it's a form of play. Lila is the word in Sanskrit. So when they talk about, on page 208, the golden person, the lonely bird, it seems like they're talking, it's mixing up descriptions, it seems to me, of both the Supreme Atman and the subordinate Atman. Because the Supreme Atman doesn't suffer reincarnation except by witnessing it happening to all of the subordinate souls. But continuing on 208 here, the left-hand column, going up and down in his dream, the god makes manifold shapes for himself, either rejoicing together with women or laughing with his friends or seeing terrible sights. People may see his playground, but himself no one ever sees. So this is God's playground. You don't see God directly, but you see God's play. It's a dream. That's the philosophy. We live in God's dream. This is like God's unconscious mind, and the spiritual world is like God's conscious mind. And God, or Vishnu, or Atman, can be described as Atman, an individual person, and Brahman, the all-pervasive impersonal potential. So concluding here on the right-hand column, page 208, an ocean is that one seer without any duality. So an ocean is that one seer. An ocean, Brahman, that one seer, Atman, without any duality. This is the Brahma world, O king. Thus did Yajnavalkya teach him, this is the highest goal, this is the highest success, the highest world. This is his highest bliss. All other creatures live on a small portion of that bliss. So now going to the Chandogya Upanishad, where the ether is mentioned, as well as in the Mundaka Upanishad. That again is exam 1, part B, question 2. Describe the concept of the ether in the Chandogya Upanishad, the Mundaka Upanishad, and the Yoga Sutras, which I will briefly talk about the Yoga Sutras. So the Chandogya Upanishad, page 208. Left-hand column, all this is Brahman. Let a man meditate on the visible world as beginning, ending, and breathing in it. Brahman. Now, man is a creature of will. What his will is in this world, so will he be when he has departed this life. That's reincarnation. If you have the will of a dog or a hog, your desires are lowly, you'll be a dog or a hog. If you have the will to perceive Vishnu, then you'll be working your way up the ladder. You might not make it all the way to Vishnu, but at least you'll be a human. So that's what they're referring to. So since your will determines your next life, returning to the Upanishad here, let him therefore have this will and belief. The intelligent, whose body is spirit, whose form is light, whose thoughts are true, whose nature is like ether, omnipresent and invisible, from whom all works, all desires, all sweet odors and tastes proceed, he who embraces all this, who never speaks, and is never surprised. So, he is myself within the heart, smaller than a corn of rice, smaller than a corn of barley, smaller than a mustard seed, smaller than a canary seed or the kernel of a canary seed. He also is myself within the heart, greater than the earth, greater than the sky, greater than heaven, greater than all these worlds. But notice in the beginning there, the intelligent, whose body is spirit, whose form is light, whose thoughts are true, whose nature is like ether, omnipresent and invisible. So ether, again, in this cosmology of the Upanishads, the universes have these spheres of elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. Ether contains everything within the universe. So at this point, I am going to talk a little bit about the 21st century cosmology to help make a little bit more sense. I think it's good to have an analogy. You might have seen, some of you probably know something about 21st century cosmology, which is based on 20th century cosmology. So this Atman Brahman, the particle of personality and the ocean of potential being, is very similar to quantum physics. So I'll be including on optional YouTube videos to watch some videos from physicists who explain quantum physics, relativity theory, and the idea of black holes with a gravitational singularity. So when we read these Upanishads, what they're saying sounds kind of incredible. All the past, present, and future are interwoven out at this ether sphere of the universe. That's where the Supreme Person's omniscience is contained. That's weird. And each of us is a little atom of consciousness, and yet we're somehow merged in these waves in this ocean of Brahman. That doesn't seem like the way things really are. Things seem to be made out of, solid objects. Here's this little plastic thing. Here's a glass. Here's a pen. This isn't a particle, and it turns into a wave. What's all this about? So the Atman Brahman foundation of the Upanishad cosmology is very similar to quantum mechanics which says that the basic building blocks of matter are particles when you perceive them, and waves of probability when you don't. And I'll briefly explain it just to give us an analogy. So here was the experiment that they did. They wanted to know, are electrons or photons or any other quantum particle, are they really particles or are they waves? Do they propagate like liquid waves? Because sometimes it seems they act like particles, sometimes it seems they act like waves. So to determine what they are, they shot electrons through a wall with two slits very close to each other, like in my finger here. And then behind it they had a detector screen. And they figured, well, when we shoot the electrons, if it goes through, if they're little particles, it'll pass right through the slit and hit directly behind the slit on the detector screen like two bands, like a machine gun. You'd have these little hits right behind the slits in the barrier. If they go through as a wave, they'll hit the two slits, and then two new waves will come out and ripple outward and interfere with each other, and you'll have a rippling pattern on the back screen. Where the two peaks amplify each other will be a bright, and where a peak and a valley cancel each other out, there'll be nothing there. So they were looking for the pattern. Two bands means they go through as particles. An interference pattern, many bands, means they go through as waves. But what happened is that after a while, after about an hour of shooting these electrons, each electron was detected as an individual particle. But the weird thing was they didn't line up directly behind the slits all the time. Sometimes they were over to the far right, to the far left, up here, over there. After an hour, those little individual particle hits took on the shape of the interference pattern that a wave would have made if it went through all at once. So it was detected by the screen as a particle, but the pattern of individual particle hits created the pattern of a wave. So they said, well, let's put an electron microscope right at these two slits and see which one it goes through. And when they did that and observed which slit the electron went through, then all of a sudden those electrons piled up directly behind the slits, just like little particles would have normally done. So the conclusion was, whatever the building blocks of matter are made of, when you observe them, they act like little particles, individual particular bits of matter. But when you're not observing them, they move through space as waves, but not material waves, not liquid waves, but waves of probability, waves of mathematical probability for where an individual particle might manifest were it to be observed. That is very, very strange. They call it quantum weirdness. It's been proven in experiments again and again and again. And one of the founders of that theory, Erwin Schrödinger, compared that particle and wave nature of quantum mechanics to the Atman Brahman philosophy of the Upanishads. We're individual selves. We're individual personal conscious beings, but at the same time, we are merged in this ocean of Brahman. That's the way Schrödinger was seeing it. And then there's another question. Is each of us a unique individual particle, or is there really only one supreme particular self? And the way the Upanishads seem to imply is it's both. The supreme self is looking through everybody else. It's as if everyone is a kind of a periscope for the supreme self. But at any rate, Atman and Brahman, it's the particle and the wave, it's the person and the impersonal nature of the self. So going back to the Chandogya Upanishad, he's saying on the left-hand column, about halfway down, he is myself within the heart, smaller than the corn of rice, smaller than this mustard seed and every other thing. And yet he's also greater than heaven, greater than all these worlds. So here's another thing I'll be pointing out as a parallel with current cosmology, the Big Bang Theory. Most of us, everyone's heard of the Big Bang Theory. So the universe is expanding. Edwin Hubble discovered that in 1929. The farther the galaxies are from Earth, the faster they seem to be expanding away from us. Well, that implies that in the ancient past, the universe was contracted into a single point, a gravitational singularity, a point of infinite density that contains all of space and all of time. So that is very similar to the idea of Atman here. Smaller than the smallest. There's nothing smaller than the gravitational singularity. It has zero volume. It has no extension in space, and yet it has a gravitational effect on space, but you can't see it directly. And yet it also is larger than the largest, because the Big Bang, everything is compacted in this little single point. It explodes, and yet strangely, that gravitational singularity also exists at each point of the encompassing sphere of the cosmos. The Big Bang echoes inward from each point of this outermost sphere. And I'll mention it now, since we're going over the ether. That Big Bang theory came from Einstein's theory of gravity, known as general relativity. So you have general relativity, you have quantum mechanics. The weird thing is you can't use relativity theory to describe quantum particles. Even though it points to a gravitational singularity, relativity theory can't explain the nature of things at that small of a scale. Yet quantum mechanics, it can't describe things that are very big, where the force of gravity is in control. So to rectify these two opposing languages of physics, they created string theory. Now again, you don't have to know about any of this on your exams, but I think it does help to understand these strange phrases in the Upanishads and other texts that we'll be reading. So string theory combines the two, and it says the little tiny particles of quantum mechanics, even smaller than them, are these little threads, these elastic strings that stretch out all the way to the outermost border of the universe, where the fabric of space-time seems to be expanding away from our perspective on Earth at the speed of light. And the strange effect of the speed of light is it stops space and time. So according to string theory, as presented by Leonard Susskind, a Stanford string theorist, Leonard Susskind, he defeated Stephen Hawking in the Black Hole War. Here's his ultimate idea. The past, the present, and the future are interwoven at each point of the outermost horizon of the cosmos, which is comparable to the ether element in the Upanishads, interwoven on a thread, which then radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation, to create the illusion, the holographic illusion of three-dimensional space. Leonard Susskind is a total atheist. He's overt about that, and yet his cosmology is very, very similar to the Upanishads, which is one of the first theologies, which I wrote my dissertation for a PhD. I wrote about this topic, not just the Upanishads. I was comparing it to all the world religions, because most of the world religions have this idea of God exists as the smallest point in the center of everyone's heart and the outermost sphere where the past, present, and future are conserved. So that is, and that's going to be one of the optional YouTube videos you can watch about Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory. So according to the cutting edge cosmology today, the entire universe is interwoven at each point of this outermost sphere, and it radiates in this illusion. Everything's like a hologram. The outermost sphere is like a holographic film. All of the information of the whole is located in each point, and these threads, these elastic threads, create this cinematic hologram developing over time. But the past, present, and future are all there. Just like on a reel of film, the whole movie is already pre-recorded. What we're experiencing is the projection of the movie, this holographic. It seems like three-dimensional solid forms, but according to string theory, this is more like a hologram. So, going back to the Upanishad here, the Atman is smaller than the smallest, similar to a gravitational singularity, and yet embraces everything in the universe, similar to the horizon of the cosmos. So with that, I'll continue on the right-hand column, page 208. So Prajapati said, so Prajapati is a great sage. And keep in mind, while he's speaking, the king of the demons and the king of the demigods are listening. So the self, which is free from sin, free from old age, from death and grief, from hunger and thirst, which desires nothing but what it ought to desire, and imagines nothing but what it ought to imagine, that's what we must search out. That's what we must try to understand. He who has searched out that self and understands it obtains all worlds and all desires. So, oh, you can obtain all the worlds and all desires. Now the demigods and demons are pricking up their ears. So the gods and demons both heard these words and said, well, let us search for that self, by which, if one has searched it out, all worlds and all desires are obtained. So for 32 years they studied with Prajapati. And he says, why have you stayed here? And he says, we want to understand that self, understanding whom grants you all desires in all the worlds. And so Prajapati said to them, the person seen in the eye, that is the self. That is what I have said. That is the immortal, the fearless. That is Brahman. They asked, sir, he who is perceived in the water and he who is perceived in a mirror, who is he? He replied, he himself indeed is seen in all these. So to understand the self, you see the self reflected in everything. Everything comes from the self. Everything is contained within the self. And you should search to understand the self, thereby reuniting your individual Atman with the Supreme Atman, the Supreme Brahman. But again, the ether was mentioned on page 208, whose nature is like ether, on the left-hand column, omnipresent and invisible. All right, so that's the first mention of ether. Now we're going on to the Mundaka Upanishad, where the second mention of ether is found. So page 209, manifest near, moving in the cave of the heart is the great being. In it is centered everything you know as moving, breathing, and blinking, as being and not being, as adorable, as the best. That is beyond the understanding of creatures. So manifest near, moving in the cave of the heart is the great being. That's Atman, Brahman. In it is centered everything you know as moving, breathing, and blinking. Similarly, according to the Big Bang cosmology, the gravitational singularity from which everything is emerging is actually omnicentric. It's wherever you happen to be in the universe, from your perspective, it will appear that you're at the center of the universe and the entire universe is expanding away from you at an exponential rate. So this Atman in the core of your heart, in the core of your own Atman, is the Supreme Atman. But at the same, everything is centered on that Supreme Atman. No matter where you are, the Supreme Vishnu is inside of you, the Supreme Atman, and that Supreme Atman is the center of everything. And that does correlate with the cosmology of that's general relativity. Again, you're not responsible for that, but I think it will help you to begin to get a grip of what these philosophical texts are talking about. So continuing here on page 209, that which is brilliant, smaller than small, that on which the worlds are founded and their inhabitants, that is the indestructible Brahman. That is the breath, speech, mind. That is the true. That is the immortal. That is our target. Hit it, my friends. So we saw the same thing in the Katha Upanishads. Use the reins of your mind to control your senses, which are like the horses pulling the chariot, which is your body. Focus on Vishnu. Get to the end of the road. Here, another analogy is a bow and arrow. Om, the sacred syllable Om, which is the sound, vibration, manifestation of Atman and Brahman. So he says, Om is the bow, the self is the arrow, Brahman is its aim. It is to be hit by a man who is not thoughtless. And then, as the arrow becomes one with the target, he will become one with Brahman. In him, the heaven, the earth, and the sky are woven. The mind also with all the senses. Know him alone as the self and leave off other worlds. He is the bridge to the immortal. So the heaven, the earth, and the sky are woven in Brahman. And again, Brahman is specifically in these texts seen as the ether, as merged with the ether, the outermost sphere of the elements of the universe. We saw in the Chandogya Upanishad, ether omnipresent and invisible. We're going to see the ether mentioned again. So Om is the bow, the self, the Atman is the arrow. You chant Om, and that shoots your Atman to the Supreme Brahman at the outermost sphere, which is where the Supreme Self resides. So I'm going to continue reading here on page 209, the right-hand column. He moves about, becoming manifold within the heart, where the arteries meet like spokes fastened to the hub of a wheel. Meditate on the self as Om. Hail to you that you may cross beyond the sea of darkness. He who understands all and who knows all, he to whom all this glory in the world belongs, the self, is placed in the ether, in the heavenly city of Brahman. He assumes the nature of mind and becomes the guide of the body of the senses. He subsists in food in close proximity to the heart. The wise who understand this behold the immortal, which shines forth full of bliss. So again, going up there on the right-hand column, he who understands all and who knows all, he to whom all this glory in the world belongs, the self, is placed in the ether, in the heavenly city of Brahman. So the ether, the supreme Atman, which is the flip side of Brahman, is interwoven in the ether, which is this outermost shell of the universe, from which the rest of the universe is projected. The omnipresent but invisible container of the universe. Now, I mentioned Leonard Susskind's string theory, where he talks about the past, the present, and the future are conserved at each point of this outermost horizon of the cosmos and projected in on these threads to create the hologram of three-dimensional space. That's also very similar to near-death experience accounts. In particular, Carl Jung, the psychologist, he said exactly the same thing. He had a heart attack in 1944. He felt his consciousness rise above the hospital, above the earth, at the outermost edge of earth. He had some very strange experiences. When he returned to his body, he said it seemed to him as if the past, present, and future are interwoven at the horizon of the cosmos, and that each of us in the material world is living in a little box hung up to the horizon by a thread. So each cubic volume of space-time is like an illusion attached to the horizon of the cosmos, which is like the ether in the Upanishads by a thread. So it was that parallel with Susskind's string theory that I wrote my dissertation on, which I then turned into a book. But I mentioned it just now because in the Mundaka Upanishad, Om is the bow, the self is the arrow. Om is the sound of the ether, of the outermost horizon of the cosmos. In 2012, a Harvard University brain surgeon, Eben Alexander, had E. coli bacteria shut down his brain. And during his out-of-body near-death experience, he also experienced the horizon of the cosmos. And not only did he realize the past, the present, and the future are there, but he heard the sound Om. So he was interviewed by Oprah. He was on the cover of, I believe it was Newsweek, or maybe it was Time, and he wrote a book about his, as a matter of fact, Eben Alexander, his book, Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's near-death experience and journey into the afterlife. So he said the same thing that we're reading here in the Mundaka Upanishad, although he didn't have any knowledge of the Upanishads when he had this experience. It was later that he realized the parallel. Out at that ether sphere, he experienced God as the sound Om, and that is what you're reading about here in the Mundaka Upanishad. So I'll continue here in the Mundaka Upanishad. On the right-hand column on page 209, at the very bottom, and then moving on to page 210, he says, in the highest golden sheath there is Brahman, without passion, without parts. That is pure, the light of lights. That is what they know who knows the self. So without parts, Atman and Brahman, they're not composed of parts. They're not a composite being made of other little parts. It's an absolute entity. The Atman, like a gravitational singularity, has no parts. Therefore, it has no extension in space. It's the source of space and time, and therefore it's not made of little bits of space-time. Everything is condensed within it. And I'll continue to read here on page 210, about halfway down the left column. He says, two birds, inseparable friends, cling to the same tree. One of them eats the sweet fruit, the other looks on without eating. So that's a classic image. In the heart are two birds, two souls. One eats the fruit, that's the conditioned soul who's identifying with the material body, and the other one is the Supreme Atman. They're inseparable friends, but the Supreme Atman doesn't enjoy the fruits of material nature. The Supreme Atman just watches, because the Supreme Atman knows, oh, this is a dream, whereas the subordinate Atmans reincarnating in the material world, identify with the body, therefore eating up the fruits of sense desire. So I'll continue to read here. On the same tree man sits, grieving, immersed, bewildered by his own impotence. But when he sees the other, contented and knows his glory, then his grief passes away. So when the one bird who's chowing down on the fruits of the tree is miserable because of this false identification with the perishable body, looks over, oh, look, my friend here in my heart, the Supreme Soul, then all of a sudden all of the remorse disappears and happiness ensues. So continuing here, when the seer sees the brilliant maker and lord of the world as the person who has his source in Brahman, then he is wise, and shaking off good and evil, he reaches the highest oneness, free from passions. Shaking off good and evil, the idea of the pairs of opposites, that's a condition of the material world, hot or cold, happy or sad. All of these pairs of opposites are united in the Supreme Atman because they emerge from the Supreme Atman. So shaking off the duality of opposites and realizing the source of light, which is the Atman, again, like the gravitational singularity, the Big Bang gave birth to light itself. When you see your individual soul united with the Supreme Person, the source of all energy, then you're free from your material desires and you can return to God. So continuing here, for he is the life, shining forth in all beings, and he who understands this becomes truly wise, not a talker only. He revels in the self, he delights in the self, and having performed his works, he rests firmly established in Brahman, the best of those who know Brahman. So then they talk about the need for abstinence and self-control, tapas, in order to be able to see the Supreme Soul within. But then after saying, well, let me just read here, the right-hand column, page 210, the true prevails, not the untrue. By the true the path is laid out, the way of the gods, on which the old sages satisfied in their desires trod, where there is that highest place of the true one. The highest place of the true one is referred to as the ether here. Whatever word is used for it, it means the outermost sphere of each universe. So continuing here, the true Brahman shines forth, grand, divine, inconceivable, smaller than small. It is far beyond what is far, and yet near here. It is hidden in the cave of the heart among those who see it even here. He is not apprehended by the eye, nor by speech, nor by the other senses, nor by austerity or good works. When a man's nature has become purified by the serene light of knowledge, then he sees him meditating on him as without parts. So, again, the Atman has no parts, and yet it's all pervasive. We'll discuss that issue when we go over the Buddhist texts in the next video. But for right now, that will answer for our exam, part B, question 2, describe the concept of the ether in the Chandogya Upanishad and the Mundaka Upanishad. I mentioned also the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and that I'm going to send a note saying you don't have to have references to it, but if you look on page 222, section 3.54, so each of these verses is numbered, so it's chapter 3, verse 54. He says, the cognition born of discrimination carries to the further shore with everything as its object in every fashion and non-sequentially. So what that means, the further shore, there's the ether again. Everything is contained in it there, non-sequentially, meaning not a past, present, and future, rather everything from the past, present, and future is contained at that furthest shore. And again, that is what people perceive often when they come back from a brush with death. That strangely, the entire universe seems to be, the entire history and future of the universe is contained at this outermost sphere, and then it radiates inward. So I will now just go over the rest of the Upanishads, which will help with exam question 1 when we compare the Upanishads to Buddhism. So on page 210, the Shvetasvatar Upanishad. I'll just read a few points here and there. It just reiterates what we've already gone over from the other Upanishads. So page 210, left-hand column. If a wise man holds his body with chest, neck, and head even, and turns his senses with the mind toward the heart, he will then in the boat of Brahman cross all the torrents of fear. A little bit in the next column to the right, let the wise man without fail restrain his mind, that chariot yoked with vicious horses. So we saw that same image in the Katha Upanishad. The horses are the senses pulling the chariot of your body. The mind is the reins, and the intelligence holds the reins. So control your senses, aim them towards the Supreme Atman known as Vishnu. On page 211, left-hand column, when yoga is being performed, the forms that come first, producing apparitions in Brahman, are those of misty smoke, sun, fire, wind, fireflies, lightning, and a crystal moon. When as earth, water, light, heat, and ether arise, oh, they mention ether again there in the Shvetashvatar Upanishad, the fivefold qualities of yoga take place. Then there is no longer illness, old age, or pain for him who has obtained a body produced by the fire of yoga. We'll just take a note. They mention ether again in the Shvetashvatar Upanishad. This is the second time I've taught this book. So every time I read through these textbooks, I'm picking up new stuff. But notice, when earth, water, fire, light, heat, and ether arise, the fivefold qualities of yoga take place. So ether. Each of us is contained in this universe where there's these concentric spheres, earth, water, fire, air, ether, but all of those elements are also contained in everyone's heart. And when you meditate on the Atman within your heart, you go through these same elements internally, and it's the ether is this omnipresent container of the universe. And through yoga, you don't have to go through a near-death experience. According to the Upanishads, you can use the techniques of yoga. So sitting with your spine straight and your head held normally, there's this intricate philosophy which we'll be going over when we go over the Yoga Sutras to discuss the three modes of nature, the gunas. They also talk about yoga. So these are mechanical techniques to help the mind become calm so that the inner soul can perceive the Supreme Atman, which is interwoven with the outermost horizon of the cosmos, referred to in most of these Upanishads as ether. When you contact that Supreme Atman and Brahman at the outermost sphere, then you're cured of all your misery, and you're also freed from the cycle of reincarnation. I'll read here on page, the bottom of the left-hand column on page 211. As a mirror tarnished by dust shines bright again after it has been cleaned, so is the one incarnate person satisfied and free from grief after he has seen the real nature of the self. And so eternal is the God who is beyond all natures. He is freed from all fetters. Now talking about who is the Supreme Atman, he indeed is the God who pervades all regions. He is the firstborn, and he is in the womb. He has been born, and he will be born. He stands behind all persons, looking everywhere. The God who is in the fire, the God who is in the water, the God who has entered into the whole world, the God who is in plants, the God who is in trees. Adoration be to that God, adoration. So looking through each individual person is the supreme person. And we saw that image of the Indra and Varochana, the kings of the demigods and demons respectively, approaching Prajapati saying, how do we want to have all the worlds and all desires fulfilled, and you told us that we have to understand the self to do that. And who is the self? And Prajapati replied, he himself indeed is seen in all these. So wherever you look, you're seeing the self. You have to realize the unifying self underlying everyone. So the Supreme Self sees the world through everybody's subjective perspective simultaneously. So you can gain objective omniscience, objective knowledge of everyone by seeing everyone's subjective opinion simultaneously. That's kind of the way God has omniscience. So now moving on to the Maitri Upanishad. I'll just read bits and pieces. They're just reaffirming what we've gone over. So the Valakilyas said to Prajapati Kratu, this is page 211, the bottom half of the page, O saint, if you thus show the greatness of that self, then who is that other different one, also called self, who, really overcome by bright and dark fruits of action, enters on a good or bad birth? Downward or upward is his course, and overcome by the pairs of opposites, he roams about. So there you go. There's two selves, the Supreme Atman and each subordinate Atman. And the image that we have, the language used in this Upanishad, is that the conditioned soul who identifies with the body is called the elemental self. So in the left-hand column at the very bottom, page 211, and lastly, he who dwells in the body is called the elemental self. Thus his immortal self is like a drop of water on a lotus leaf, and he himself is overcome by the qualities of nature. Then, because he is thus overcome, he becomes bewildered, and because he is bewildered, he sees not the Creator, the Holy Lord, abiding within himself. So that, now here's the image on page 212. Now, as even a ball of iron, heated by fire and hammered by smiths, assumes different forms, the elemental self, pervaded by the inner man and hammered by the qualities, becomes manifold. So the elemental self changes. The inner man, that's Vishnu, the supreme Atman, doesn't change. So continuing with this analogy, and on the left-hand column, page 212, and those multiplied things are impelled by the conscious being as the wheel by the potter. And as when the ball of iron is hammered, the fire is not overcome, so the inner man is not overcome, but the elemental self is overcome because it has united itself with the elements. That's why it's the elemental self. The Atman who identifies with earth, water, fire, and air is now called the elemental self because it identifies with the material ingredients. And then he mentions on the right-hand column the gunas. He doesn't use the word gunas, but that's what he's talking about, which is part B, question 1. What are the three gunas as described in the Yoga Sutras? And the other text we're going to be discussing in another video today. But just tamas and rajas. Tamas is one of the gunas. The gunas are these three modes of material nature from which all material ingredients are made. So I'm going to skip that for now, and we'll come back to that. But just note, they do mention it on page 212. Now, the last Upanishad we'll be going over in this video is the Taittiriya Upanishad. And here we see Om again. So page 212, left-hand column, Hari, Om, may it, Brahman, protect us both. May it enjoy us both. May we acquire strength together. May our knowledge become bright. May we never quarrel. Peace, peace, peace. That's Shanti is the word that they're using there. He who knows the Brahman attains the highest Brahman. On this, the following verse is recorded. He who knows Brahman, which is conscious, which is without end, as hidden in the depth of the heart, in the highest ether, he enjoys all blessings at one with the omniscient Brahman. So again, the ether is mentioned in this Upanishad. So for that part B, question 2, describe the concept of the ether in the Chandogya Upanishad and the Mundaka Upanishad. Well, it's also in the Taittiriya Upanishad, and wherever in the Upanishads they mention ether, you can refer to it. But so long as you have a couple of quotes from at least 2 of these Upanishads to support your answer and tell me that it's the outermost sphere of the universe in which the highest self is interwoven to create everything, then you've got the right answer. So these part B questions are worth 25 points each. So if you support your answer with quotes from the book, then that's an easy 25 points. So continuing here, he who knows Brahman, which is conscious, which is without end, as hidden in the depth of the heart, in the highest ether, he enjoys all blessings at one with the omniscient Brahman. Different from the body, which consists of the essence of food, is the other, the inner self, which consists of breath. The inner self fills the body. It also has the shape of man, like the human shape of the body is the human shape of the inner self. We'll come back to that when we go over the Buddhist arguments against the Hindu concept of Atman. So now in the right-hand column, page 212, there is also an inner self that consists of mind. The next paragraph, different from what consists of mind is another inner self which consists of understanding. Next paragraph, different from what consists of understanding is still another inner self which consists of bliss. So there's these concentric sheaths or spheres of the self that they're discussing in this Upanishad, but the shell that contains them all is the highest ether. That's where each of us is merged with the past, present, and future of the entire universe, and we become one to some degree with the Supreme Brahman. We have a glimpse of our union with this supreme source of being. All right, so the Katha Upanishad we already went over, so that will, so we're done for the readings in this video. So let's just briefly go over the exam questions that we've covered. So exam 1, potential questions from part B. We started with part B, question 3. Who is Vishnu as described in the Katha Upanishad? Vishnu, the supreme Atman, the supreme Brahman. The goal of life, the goal of all meditation, to see whom is to be relieved from the cycle of reincarnation and filled with your natural element of bliss. Part 2 is describe the concept of the ether in the Chandogya Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad, and the Yoga Sutras. So the Yoga Sutra I mentioned on page 222, they don't use the word ether, but that's what they're referring to. I like that section because they talk about things being non-sequential, which is a reference to the past, the present, and the future existing, interwoven at the ether, which is the manifestation of Vishnu in the material universe, the outermost encompassing sphere. But we've also seen the ether mentioned in the Taittiriya Upanishad, and where else did we discover? Another Upanishad that I hadn't seen. So wherever you see the word ether mentioned in the Upanishads, you can refer to that if you choose. Question 2 from part B. Question 1 from part B is about the 3 gunas, which we'll be discussing in the video after the next one, where I compare Buddhism to the Hindu concept. So in the next video, we will be going over question 1 from part A of the potential questions for exam 1, which is compare the Buddhist view of Anatman to the Hindu conception found in the Upanishads. So to do that, we've gone over the Upanishads now. Now we're going to go over the Buddhist view, and as we do that, I will be comparing that Buddhist view to the Upanishads.